Hello, my name is drakemeaney. I am a PGY1 pharmacy resident at UPMC St. Margaret in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And today I'll be doing a virtual presentation of my STFM poster on an evaluation of actual discharge antibiotic prescription length and its congruence with intended length of therapy. And so to kick off this presentation, I'd like to pose a question. What if I told you that 1 in 5 patients that we discharge from the hospital are discharged on an antibiotic prescription that has an error? This may sound a little alarming, and we'll dive into this and a few other topics regarding discharge antibiotic prescriptions over the next couple minutes. And so while I'm presenting this poster, I will just direct you, I'm going to be zooming in and dragging between the different aspects of the poster. And so for those of you that may get a little bit dizzy, I just wanted to provide that before I dove into the background. And so without further ado, a little bit of background on this subject. So patients end up on a lot of antibiotics, whether it's in the hospital or on discharge. We're really sending people on a lot of antibiotics. And prescribing errors run rampant when we do these discharge antibiotics. And really, these antibiotics may be longer or shorter than intended if we do have errors. And shorter than intended courses can run the risk of reinfection or readmission, whereas longer courses can run the risk of adverse events or antimicrobial resistance. And we really wanted to evaluate this question because we felt that this issue was happening at our family med hospital, but we weren't sure at what frequency this discordance in antibiotic prescriptions was occurring. And so we wanted to evaluate that and kind of evaluate this question. And so in order to do this, we really looked at a primary outcome of a difference in intended, which is what did the prescriber put in their day of discharge note? What did they say that they wanted to send the patient home on? That's intended. And then actual length is what prescription was actually sent over to the pharmacy, what got sent to Rite Aid, what got sent to Walgreens, and how the length differs between those two aspects of the discharge antibiotic. Secondary outcomes that we looked at were error rate and type by the different medical services, prescriber types, routes of administration, as well as looking at if infectious disease involvement played a role, as well as looking at related readmission rate if there was an error. And so our study design, we undertook this study at our family med hospital in Pittsburgh, a single site retrospective chart review, looking at adults that were discharged on an antibiotic over about 1.5 year period. And we really only excluded patients and their prescriptions if we weren't able to determine the intended duration because a prescriber perhaps didn't put it in their day of discharge note. And so just to zoom back out for a second, the thing that kind of jumps off the page here is this big bolded 16% of actual discharge antibiotic prescriptions had a different length than intended. And, this really jumps off the page, but then when we zoom back in to look at table 2, we evaluated 236 different prescriptions, and total numbers of errors were just around 18.2%. And then differences in length were just around 16%. There were a couple patients that had a different dose, but was still for the same duration. And then when we looked at, okay, they're getting discharged on, let's say 16% patients have an error there, but is the days of difference actually significant? And we found that it wasn't, but our study wasn't really powered to evaluate this, but good to at least look into. And then looking at figure 1 type of error, biggest type of error was too many cooks in the kitchen. So multiple prescribers who misunderstood the intended duration. One person says this, one person says that, ends up getting sent out on the wrong length. Second biggest was that there was a calculation error. So prescriber said, we want them on 7 days of therapy, and then miscalculated and accidentally sent them out on 9. And then other types of error were if patients stayed a little bit longer than they were supposed to, but the prescriber already sent the prescription and didn't modify it, or if the prescriber just forgot to discontinue the script. And then there are other sources of error as well. Looking at overall readmission rate, So patients with an error had similar rates of readmission within 30 days, but actually had a significant increase by about 10%. So 16.2% compared to 5.9% when we look at related readmissions within 30 days. So was it related to the infection that they came in with originally? And so lastly here, just looking at error rate by infectious disease involvement. So did they help choose the antibiotics that the patient was sent home on? And what we found was that it was relatively equal as far as if they were involved or not, but there was a pretty precipitous increase in number of errors when infectious disease when it was involved. And we evaluated this with a p-value, was not significant, but once again, didn't really power this to account for that or really look into that question specifically. But I will say that looking into the types of error, more commonly than not, it was due to too many cooks in the kitchen being the reason for error in these cases. Limitations of this study were that interpretation of the intended length didn't really account for changes made by prescribers after the discharge note was written. So they said 3 days, but then switched their minds after the note was finalized and didn't update it. Also, we only captured readmissions to UPMC hospitals. So if they were admitted to different networks of hospitals in the area, we would not have captured that for readmissions. And then also, this is another thing that other studies did, looking at discharge medications. They conducted prescriber interviews to evaluate possible sources of error. And we did not do that in this case, but I think it's a step towards the future. And looking at conclusions. So approximately 1 in 5 patients were discharged on an erroneous antibiotic prescription. It had an error within it. And then another conclusion is that patients with a discharge antibiotic prescription error were 64% more likely to have a related readmission within 30 days of discharge. And then finally, just thinking about types of error, the most common ones seen were miscalculation, misunderstandings with multiple prescribers, or just a lack of duration adjustment when a hospital stay was extended. And so next steps for this project, really what I'd like to be able to do is conduct a root cause analysis of these error types in order to help evaluate potential electronic health record modifications and figure out what prescriber education we need to enact in order to better account for these errors and try to reduce them from happening in the future. And so I thank you for listening to this presentation. I'm going to zoom out again, but I will reference you guys to check out this bottom section here. You can scan the QR code on either side. More information will have lots of different tables on the data and kind of looking specifically at the types of services, the type of prescriber, and a few more other outcomes. References are also there. And then feel free to contact me on Twitter or reach out otherwise if you have any questions or comments or just want to interact. So I appreciate you listening to this presentation, and I hope you have a great STFM conference. Thank you.